Okay, why don't we get started? Thank you everyone again for coming. My name is Jake Yeston. I am the editor overseeing the physical sciences research section of Science Magazine at AAAS, and I'm also the point person there for our data and code archiving and citation policies. And in that capacity, I've interacted a great deal over the last 5 years with Shelley Stahl, who I think if you've done anything in this arena, you realize she's just a tireless advocate for constantly moving initiatives forward. She never rests on her laurels, and I think it's terrific that she's carried so many communities along and really helped us to keep moving in the direction of fair data, fair code, and open science. So I'm here again on behalf of the AAAS, and this is the second in what we hope will be a year-long seminar series on the data sharing for societies, general subject. And in addition to AAAS and of course AGU, the American Geophysical Union, where Shelley's from, several other, 6 other sponsoring societies include the American Astronomical Society, the American Meteorological Society Board on Data Stewardship, the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. And so today's speakers are going to focus on incentives. And I think that's an immensely important topic because I, as I said, attend quite a few workshops on this subject, and often the people at these workshops are journal and repository editors and managers and a relatively select group of academics who are already true believers in this subject. And I think the challenge that we all face when we come up with great ideas for how to make data and code more fair and how to make science more open is how to incentivize the far larger group of people who I think just don't even have a strong opinion about this subject, right? They just want to keep getting their work done and, try to do whatever they're asked to do in as seamless and least time-consuming a way as they can. And so I think the challenge that we all face is to figure out a way to incentivize them so that they understand that it's not just something that they're being asked to do, but something that in fact will improve their research and improve the overall science community if they can move in this direction. And so I'm really pleased today to introduce 2 experts in this area, both of whom have been in the trenches for decades trying to work on this subject. And they're going to tag team, they're going to give a sort of joint talk together. And after that, there's going to be some time for questions. So the first one is Greg Tananbaum, and he has over 20 years experience in scholarly communications, academic publishing, and technology, and led the effort to develop both the How Open Is It guide and the Open Access Spectrum Evaluation tool, as well as access and license indicators for NISO. In addition, Greg has served as president of the Berkeley Electronic Press and director of product marketing for EndNote. And then the second speaker is Chris Bourg, and she's now currently director of libraries at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she began her career in the United States Army and worked at West Point for a little while before moving to Stanford for 10 years. And then after that, arriving at MIT. And she has extensive experience promoting equitable and open scholarship and is an advocate for the role of libraries in promoting social justice and democracy. And she's currently co-chair of the MIT Ad Hoc Task Force on Open Access to MIT's Research. And so, as I mentioned, it's going to be a sort of tag team setup. Greg is going to start out introducing the work of the United States National Academies on aligning incentives for open science and a toolkit that's been developed to help scholarly societies and organizations move toward relevant incentives for people to share their research data and other outputs in support of open science. And then Chris Bourg is going to talk a little more specifically about current progress, opportunities, and challenges in the context of her experience at MIT. And so I would like to remind everyone to please keep yourselves muted while the talk is going on. And if you have questions, feel free to mention those questions in the chat. And when you ask a question, please let me know your name and also your affiliation or where you're from. And once the talks are complete, we'll go through and I'll do some moderation. And so again, thank you very much for coming. And I look forward to Greg leading off.
Terrific. Thank you, Jake. And my screen is coming up. Hopefully everyone will be able to see that. And Jake, if you can just give me a quick nod when it's loaded.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you again. And thank you, Shelley. And thanks to the sponsors for pulling together this series. It's great to be a part of it. I'm happy to be speaking. I'm more excited probably for the entirety of the series and just being able to listen and learn. As Jake said, my name is Greg Tananbaum, and I run the Open Research Funders Group, which is a partnership of leading philanthropic organizations that, as the name would suggest, are committed to the open sharing of research outputs. We believe this is better for philanthropy, better for science, and better for society. And so we really work to serve as a community of practice for funders to develop and advance their policies around open, and also to serve as the funder's voice in the cross-stakeholder conversations that are increasingly happening about norms and incentives and policies. We're able to do this in part because we have a fairly large footprint. Our members have assets in excess of $100 billion, and annual grant making is in the $10 billion range. And we run the gamut across biomedical and life sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, and humanities. I'm particularly pleased to be here today presenting in concert with my friend, Chris Bourg, and we're going to talk about some of the what we think are the proactive and productive ways in which professional societies are stimulating open data sharing and open science more generally. So I'm just going to dig in. So in my role, as Jake mentioned, at the ORFG, I'm helping to coordinate the National Academies Roundtable on aligning incentives for open science. And just to give you a sense of who the roundtable, who's involved in the roundtable and what it's about, we're bringing together senior leadership from universities and funding agencies and societies and foundations and industry to discuss, as the name would suggest, incentives for adopting open science practices, but also to look at what the current barriers are and ways to work with communities to really specifically unpack those barriers and develop hiring and review and tenure and promotion and funding practices that are more reflective of open. And the reason I think that the organizations that are listed on the screen here are engaging in this work is, in some capacity, they're all trying to tackle really big societal challenges, right? Pursuing the mysteries of science and nature, or attempting to gain a better understanding of the human condition or our place in the universe. And really the fundamental principles that undergird open science are key accelerators of those missions, right? So if you think about the rapid sharing of results, the rapid sharing of underlying data, the democratization of information, increased collaboration, research transparency and replicability, those are catalysts for those big missions. In terms of the roundtable, Jake mentioned this idea of a toolkit. We're actually at an interesting point of the roundtable. We're about halfway through our 3-year life cycle. Our members, who you saw, the organizations that are represented, have formed a number of working groups, and those working groups have produced actionable guidance and resources designed for university leadership and academic department chairs and research funders and government agencies and other stakeholders. And that toolkit really tries to lay out the whys and the hows of open science, right? So it's meant to be a modular set of resources. There's best practices, there's success stories, there's sample language, there's talking points, there's rubrics that can be adapted and adopted by a range of stakeholders, including societies. this is because the National Academies is the National Academies, there's a process by which they put their seal on it, and it gets disseminated through their channels. This was presented at the November Roundtable. It'll be out on the website quite shortly. If anyone needs or wants a copy of the draft, I'm more than happy to share that now in the spirit of openness, and I'll have my email address at the end, and you can just shoot me a line and I'll send it. I'll also mention just one thing that's available and is crowdsourced. So if you're interested and you have success stories that talk about how open has worked in your discipline, projectopen.io is an open access open science success stories database that looks from different disciplines and different types of resources, making the affirmative case for open. So we're committed to doing this. We're committed to developing and socializing these tools, really because fundamentally we're convinced that research has its greatest impact when it can be accessed and tested and discussed and built upon. I think many of us often have a mindset in science that we should spread the seeds of our knowledge and sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. And the problem with that is that we're really, whether we know or not, we're putting up barriers that actually prevent that from happening. A few of them are listed here on the screen. If we want to make the impact and truly let those flowers bloom, we need to make research more transparent, and it needs to be more replicable, and it needs to be more accessible. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the things on the right there, although I could. Citizen science is a good example, just pulling from that list. It's really difficult for the public to engage with and to participate in and to co-create science when they can't access it, right? You can't have citizen science if you don't have open science. If you think about the infrared images that get freely disseminated as part of the Milky Way project, and society contributing to the identifying of stellar wind bubbles, or Project Budburst, which is this great project that has citizen volunteers that are both pulling and pushing data to dig into the timing of the life cycles of plants. You can't do that stuff if there's a barrier between the science and the people. And so, I mean, there are lots of examples, of course, but I think the through line here is there's no effective citizen science if, again, they can't get their hands on the science. And when research is open, it's also easier to test it, to question it, to replicate it, and as a consequence, a really important consequence, to trust it, right? Open science is more transparent science, which ultimately I think will lead to better public policy as well. So this is sort of, why we're so animated by the work. And I suspect some of you, know and feel these things as well. I also really, just going back a second, there's an important point that I don't want to elide over, which is the idea of knowledge equity, right? So in our current system, the exchange of scientific information often occurs in very direct and personal interactions. So you think about data is a great example, right? Data will be shared upon request. Fine, send the creator, send the author an email and they'll share it with you. But there's a power dynamic there, right? If you're not a close peer, if you're not a colleague, if you're not from an R1 institution, if you're not from the global north, if you're not from the academy, there's a power dynamic that really precludes that from happening at scale, right? And so we think about who has access to the knowledge, who has access to the data. Again, that's part of the fundamental reason why we do this. And the net effect of all of this slide, is making science more transparent, more efficient, more inclusive, is ultimately going to engender more engagement with science, more confidence in science. If I can roll up my sleeves and test something, I get more invested in it. When I'm a part of something, I'm more likely to trust it. And I think that's an underestimated but potentially really broad impact of this discussion that we're having. So just thinking about the roundtable and how we operationalize those concepts, right? Because what we're talking about is ultimately a realignment of research culture, right? Incentives is about culture. If we want people to share data, we want them to change their behaviors, we have to have the proper incentives in place to stimulate that. And our theory of change is that we really need to develop what we call mutually reinforcing vectors, which is a fancy way of saying researchers are hearing consistently from a range of influencers that they care about that open practices are both warmly encouraged and properly rewarded. And so in practice, what that really means is the guidance and incentives that a researcher receives from their department chairs, from their university leadership, from their funders, and yes, from their professional societies, consistently points towards open. I'm firmly of the belief that we have a general consensus on the benefits, the hypothetical, the theoretical, the benefits in a vacuum of research transparency, of data sharing, of replicability, of fair principles. But we really need to take care to make sure that we signal this clearly to our community by properly promoting and rewarding those practices, right? So what often happens is funders are pointing at universities and department chairs point to the provost and the provost point to the professional societies and so on. And we just need to stop that. And we need to focus on the points of leverage that we each directly control. So speaking personally, I coordinate the Open Research Funders Group, funders. We do a lot of work within the philanthropic community to embed open science within grant requirements, because that's the area that we are best positioned to directly affect. Through the Roundtable, we work with university leaderships and departments to consider how to embed open science in hiring and review and tenure and promotion. Those are the points of leverage they control. And societies really play a unique and overarching role in all of this, right? Because if we're going to be successful in embedding open science within this fabric, within funding, within tenure and promotion, we really do need to acknowledge, and I think Chris will really dig into this, that what constitutes best open practices in anthropology is very different than best open practices in zoology. And so societies are really critical in helping to identify and articulate and socialize appropriate norms for their discipline. They're absolutely critical in that regard. So just in terms of applying our theory of change, I'm going to turn over to Chris, who's going to talk about what this looks like in practice at MIT. And Chris, just tell me when you want me to advance the slides and off I'll go.
I will, Greg. Thanks very much. And it's great to see everyone, and thanks for coming out for this part of this seminar series. It's actually kind of fun to look at the participants and see a range of familiar names and actually a range of folks that I haven't met yet. So this is a great time for us to meet new people and sort of build the coalition, because open science is a collective action sort of problem, and the solution will be collective action as well. So stuff like this seminar is super important. So I've been asked to talk about how we've applied the theory of change that motivates the National Academies Roundtable work, how we've been doing that at MIT. And one of the things to note is, of course, that as you think about applying, advancing open science at an institution or even within a society, sort of culture and history and context matters a lot. And I happen to be fortunate that I'm at an institution that actually has a long history of supporting and taking action around openness, going back 20 years to open courseware, where MIT started sharing syllabus and course materials openly, to we have a faculty open access policy that is 12 years old and has resulted in 51% of MIT's faculty journal articles published since 2009 are now openly available in our repository. And then in 2017, we constituted an open access task force, which I was able to co-chair with Hal Abelson, to figure out, okay, what's next? How can we move further? And I note that we constituted that task force in 2017, because you'll notice the date on here is 2019. It took us 2 years of conversations across campus before we were ready to publish our final recommendations out of that task force. And some of what I'll talk about comes out of what we learned in those conversations. So next slide, Greg. As we started to make progress immediately after the open access task force, the first thing we did, our most visible and I think pretty important progress that we started to make around advancing open, has been around advocating for, and in some cases, getting publishers to agree to licenses that provide more open and equitable access to journal content. And I know this seminar is not about journal articles, it's about data, so I'll do this quickly, but there were some comments in the chat about this. We published a framework that described an approach to publisher contracts that prioritizes author choice and control of their own content while seeking transparent and sustainable prices for the value-added services that publishers do provide on top of that content that scholars create. We have had success with that framework with some non-APC based open deals with ACM and with PLOS, and perhaps famously, or not infamously, depending on where you fall on this, we have not as yet been able to negotiate a contract with Elsevier that aligns with our framework. But because we spent that time creating a framework, clearly stating what we were looking for, vetting it across campus and getting support across campus at the dean and the provost level, we got support across campus to cancel our contract with Elsevier until they're willing to offer a contract that aligns. Wait, where are you? Where are you, Greg? Okay, next slide.
Hit it by accident, so we're still there.
No, you were ahead of me. You were anticipating me. So, okay, so next.
Okay. It's going, I promise. Yep.
All right, I'm gonna start talking anyway. Okay. Now, in some ways, as we turn our attention to data, I'm not gonna say that looking at opening up journal articles is easy, but data, to me, is a special kind of complicated. And what I want to share a little bit is some of the themes that emerged in our conversations across campus during the course of the Open Access Task Force. And the first theme that emerged really powerfully was, and Greg touched on this, is people want to know, what do we mean by data? When we talk about, hey, we think it's good that people openly share their data, people want to know which data, what do you consider data? And then that conversation usually went into folks sharing all kinds of special cases of data that, because of their specialness, they could not, should not, or would not be openly shared. And some of that need to define data comes from a very real need to scope our efforts around data sharing. So we did need to distinguish between original data collected and created in the course of research, for example, from pre-existing data that's used in some way. We also need to talk about qualitative versus quantitative data, about proprietary data that in many cases researchers were only able to get their hands on by promising that they wouldn't share it, right? And then of course there's the fact that everybody thinks their own data is very special, and of course it is. And even if individuals don't think their data is special, it is true that there, as Greg mentioned, there are huge disciplinary differences about the kind of data that is collected, and what that implications that has for sharing. And there's also huge differences across disciplines in how ready those disciplines are to take up open data practices, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of norms, right? So part of our work was reassuring folks that our goal was actually responsible sharing of data. And a phrase that we use often is as open as possible and as restricted as necessary. That's kind of the goal. We also had to address the very human and very common response to what is, any kind of open sharing of research is in fact a tragedy of the commons problem, right? And so many researchers very much want everyone else to share their data so they can use it, and so they can validate and replicate that research or use it in their own new research, but they're a little less eager to share their own data for a variety of reasons. One of the big ones that we're trying to tackle in the roundtable is because of these misaligned incentives, right? And I think most of you on this call understand that it's in many cases more rewarding career-wise to hoard your own data and get as many publications as possible out of it than it is to share that data so that others can also create new knowledge from it. And part of what this roundtable is trying to do is sort of expose that misalignment and then try and address it, right? It's also hard and time consuming and in some cases costly to share data effectively. So there are some challenges. And those are some of the ones that we've encountered. Another challenge, of course, is simply the immense and overwhelming scale of it. This is almost a be careful what you ask for situation. If everyone started sharing all their data now, most institutions have nowhere to put it or manage it. The amount of data produced and collected by scholars sort of boggles the imagination when you put it all together. Despite that, we have made some progress, right? Those are very real challenges, but we've made some progress. And here's a good time for me to give a shout out to my colleague who I know is also on the call, Amy Nurnberger, who is the program head for the data management services at MIT and also is co-chairing the team that is charged with implementing all of the recommendations of MIT's Open Access Task Force. And that team very quickly worked on providing a baseline definition of research data. And they did a huge amount of research, lots of definitions out there. And the one we adopted was this one on the slide that comes out of Queensland University. I will also say that Amy was a part of a team that with leadership from the libraries and in the person of Amy and others across campus, including the Vice Provost of Research Office, developed a set of research data principles so that our campus could have some touchstone for consensus on, again, what we're aiming for, which is around accessibility of the research, fair data principles come into play here, security of the research, and then of course, compliance with funder and other regulations and guidelines. So that's some of the progress that we've made. And again, my hat's off to Amy and her team for really spearheading much of that progress. We still have some opportunities ahead of us. A data registry, and this could just as easily, I debated whether to put our data registry under progress or opportunity, because we do have a pilot of a minimally viable product where we've collaborated with 3 big research groups on campus. And the idea behind the data registry is that in order for data to be accessible and for scholars to get some credit for creating and sharing data, that data has to be indexed and ultimately linked to the publications and grants and other outputs and impacts that sharing that data has. You know, indexing things is right in the library's wheelhouse. So the MIT libraries took on that project, working with 3 research groups. And again, we have a minimal viable product that has started to create indexes of the open data that those research groups have shared and created. And the opportunity here is to take that and demonstrate the value of that indexing to our community and then start to scale it up. The other 2 data-based sort of recommendations from our Open Access Task Force that were about data. One was to create an open data fund as a way to incentivize and support work on the infrastructure that's needed to share data, whether it's a disciplinary project or something cross-disciplinary. And, you know, I have to report that, as I'm sure is happening everywhere else, creating new funds is always hard, and that was made exponentially harder due to the economic implications of the pandemic. So that remains on this slide as an opportunity yet to be seized. But the final recommendation was to support and encourage credit for working on opening up and sharing data, right, at the researcher level. And I think that is absolutely connected to our work on creating the data registry. To give credit, you have to be able to point to something, you have to measure it. So the data registry gives us that opportunity. I'd also say that one of the reasons we do sort of want to talk about what we do at MIT in the context of groups like this is that support for data sharing and credit for data sharing only happens when it becomes normative. across institutions and across societies and across disciplines, so that crediting that work formally becomes both easier and more common. Okay, over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. So Chris did, as always, a bang-up job in talking about what this really means in practice and talking from an institutional perspective. And I wanted to just tag that by giving a few brief examples of the role societies are playing to practically advance open in their spheres of influence. These are representative. These are not the only societies, but I think they provide a good cross section. So that's why we're highlighting them. So one is SIPS, which is the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. And they've done a great job of collecting examples of psychology job postings that explicitly contain open science criteria. You can see it's in the bottom of the screen. It says, our department embraces the values of open and reproducible science, and candidates are strongly encouraged to address in their statements how they have pursued and or plan to pursue these goals in their work. That's relatively modest, right? That is one sentence in a job posting. But it is a point of leverage for that department. It is an opportunity for that department to signal, if you are going to be a part of this department, this is something that we care about, and we hope you will care about it too. And from a practical perspective, it's just awkward, right? If you're completing the job application, you leave that blank, it just feels a little bit weird, right? So just asking the question itself has power. SIPS, by collecting this and by highlighting it within the discipline, has increased the frequency with which this one sentence has gotten posted gotten included in job postings. It is a small nudge that in aggregate can have a significant impact. The second one I'll mention is the Academic Data Science Alliance. They've created an interest group for discussions about the intersection between data science and open research and open scholarship. So they meet regularly, starting to meet regularly, to explore practical issues like how to publish open data and get proper credit for the work. And I know that was a theme that came up in the chat. That group is working to define best practices within data science and what it is, how we can properly acknowledge the really important and painstaking work that goes into preparing and sharing data, so that it is not just something that happens in the background and is not properly rewarded. The Linguistic Society of America is the other one I'll mention. So they have worked directly with the Roundtable to draft open science language that can be used by linguistics departments in hiring, in reviews, in tenure and promotion discussions. They've also adapted a rubric that we've created that allows the departments to evaluate the researchers' responses, right? So it's one thing to be able to ask the question. That's really important in and of itself. But when someone says, well, here's what I do to make my work open, how do we know if that's a good answer or not? How do we know on an absolute or a relative basis if that's a good answer or not? This rubric is not going to solve that for all disciplines and be sort of out of the box ready to go, but it at least helps formulate some thinking in that regard. Obviously, as I said before, more than happy to share these resources to anyone who might be interested or really, frankly, just curious. And we can do a specific and deeper dive into any or all of the elements if your society is interested in learning more. Obviously, those are just illustrative examples, but there are many, many ways in which societies are engaging and thinking about open incentives and open data and fair data. One area that I really want to address head on, because I think it's important, and I know that it's come up in the chat as well, is I think there is a trepidation around societies doing anything. Some societies feel a trepidation around doing anything regarding open because there's concern that open access is going to endanger your journal revenue streams. I want to be very, very clear. I'm not a business model expert. I would not presume to tell you what your long-term economic forecasting should look like. What I can say is that as the subject line of this seminar would suggest, open is about a lot more than journals and journal articles. It encompasses data and code and pre-registration plans and digital scholarship and so much more. And so I would just say, if you're feeling an existential dread about developing an open science strategy for the society, you might think about starting with some aspects of the research lifecycle that don't feel quite so intimidating. Open access, I saw in the chat, there's lots of routes to open access. There's diamond, there's gold, there's green, there's the version of record, the author approved manuscript, transformative agreements, and cascading, and subscribe to open. Lots of things are being tested today. And they're being tested by lots of publishers in the society realm and beyond. Again, that's not the work that I do all day, every day, but I know folks who do, and Chris knows folks who do. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we can absolutely put you in touch with folks who work in that space deeply and regularly. Again, just to be clear, I'm really keenly aware that for many of you, this idea of open is the feeling about open access and what we do about what a potential post paywall world looks like is a really big, takes up a lot of oxygen. As Jake mentioned at the outset, I was a publisher myself. I chaired the board of a society publisher, so I get that. But I guess what I'm asking is, what we're asking, Chris and I both, is if it's possible to try and stick a pin in that for a moment and just think about your organization as a thought leader, maybe the thought leader in your discipline, right? And in that mode, what do you believe that your research culture should be, and how do you think findings should be shared and discussed and built upon to further understand your world, and what are the big questions? What are the big generational challenges that we might be able to tackle with a more efficient and more transparent and more open research ecosystem? Those are obviously really big and meaty conversations. We're not going to solve it in the next 20 minutes, but let's start having those conversations, right? This slide is divided into asks and offers. We really believe that societies are crucial to establishing the norms and the language and the incentives and the exemplars in your given disciplines. When you're able to do that, that will propagate through the research ecosystem. It's going to propagate to departments. It's going to influence their hiring practices, the conversations they have about tenure and promotion. It's going to influence how they do research methods training. It's going to influence funders in the space and the questions they should ask. It's going to propagate. I know this feels like a third rail, but it's going to propagate to tenure and promotion over time. So I guess what we're really asking, our primary ask, is for you to activate and become one of these reinforcing vectors. And for our part, we have expertise in facilitating these conversations. If you say, we want to explore this, we can work with you to tailor a program to suit your discipline and your society's specific needs. Chris and I feel fervently about these issues, but we're not true believers in one specific and set outcome. I think we feel more like Sherpas to help navigate the process than anything else. We would also be eager to, more than happy, I'll put it that way, to support any cross-disciplinary cohort. If societies sort of self-aggregate and say, we want to talk about this together, we think a community of practice approach maybe makes some sense. That's work the National Academies Roundtable would be, again, more than happy to help facilitate. That's a very efficient way to share progress and ask questions among peers, to develop best practices and so forth. And so really just in sum, whatever way you decide to engage, we can lend our expertise, we can lend the name of the National Academies, the resources that we've developed, our project management capabilities, Chris's charm and wit. We can lend all those things to the discussion to hopefully make the work more efficient and a little bit less daunting for you and your colleagues. And I think with that, I'm gonna just stop, and Jake and Shelley, if you guys want to help us navigate through the questions, we'll have a discussion. But thank you all. All right.
Thank you so much, Greg and Chris. That was terrific. And there's some really interesting and lively discussion in the chat. I just want to let people know I'm going to try to not focus today on business models for paying for open access. I think it's an important subject, but I think that there's a lot of other things to talk about in this particular forum. And so that doesn't mean I don't think it's important. I just think it can sort of, sidetrack a discussion. And so let me start with the first question, which was, sorry, I'm scrolling back up to it. This was a question that was from Richard Nakamura, and basically the question was, what are better ways to track researcher performance in open science? And Chris, I'm curious from your perspective of being on the ground implementing MIT's policies. How did you go about setting up benchmarks so that you knew that people were doing what you were asking them to do?
Wow, that's a great question. And essentially, we are using, we get data about what's published every year. We're only tracking articles right now, right? So that 51% of articles citation, that's based on us tracking data of what MIT has published and what we can get into our repository. So we are not yet at the point of doing any tracking in terms of data sharing. But the data registry is a purely voluntary project that is where willing research groups have worked with the libraries to start to let us help them index the open data that they're sharing. And to us, that's sort of the necessary prerequisite of being able to sort of track whether people are sharing their data. You have to index, know where it is and index it and have some persistent links to it, if that makes sense. So we're not really there yet, I guess, is the answer, unfortunately, in terms of data.
Greg, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add one way to do it, one way to contribute to a solution is to ask, right? So we if you're affiliated with a university, there's annual reviews or some form of periodic review, and in that form, you're asked, what have you published? Typically, what have you published since the last time we asked? And obviously, scholars are more than happy to include that information because it shows how productive they have been. Ask about their data. Ask what they've done, where they've shared it, what they've produced, and obviously, ultimately, who's used it and how are important questions too. But start by asking.
Thanks. So another point that I think people were mentioning in the chat, that it was admirably honest that Chris was open about people coming up and saying, well, look, if I hoard my data, that's better for me, right? I mean, I think that's a prevalent attitude out there, even if people are sort of not necessarily mentioning it. And so I wonder if there are some high-profile examples. Obviously, Greg, you mentioned the crowdsourced types of projects. If there are some high-profile examples, so when somebody brings that point up, you can point to something and maybe say, well, these are some examples where actually sharing data improved outcomes rather than.
I'll just say there are literally hundreds of examples, and I would point folks to the project open.io, where you can look by broad disciplinary category to find those stories. Often, it is an anecdote, or for some folks it may be an anecdote. For some folks it may be a formal research study that looks at this. We try to have resources of a variety of types to talk about that. But there's a circular logic there, right? I hoard my data because that's how I get rewarded. We're trying to change research incentives, right? That's the idea, is to say we don't think that's best for science. And so if we don't think it's best for science, we have to in some way demonstrate it's not best for you and your career as well, right? So if suddenly we say, look, we really value open science, and we're going to ask you, how have you shared your data? Who's used it, and what impact has it had? Not impact just in terms of impact factor, but what's the actual impact been? It's a change for all of us, right? It's very easy to say I published in Cell Science and Nature, I published in a journal, and it has this impact factor, and it's one number or it's one brand name, and we get it. We don't have to do any more. We don't have to apply any more of our cognitive senses to understand what impact is. We're asking to change that. We get it. We get that that's a heavy lift. On the other hand, the upside is quite significant.
Right.
The other thing, if I could jump in, is because I do think it's really relevant to Greg's point about a role that societies can play in helping to shift the norms, right? And to inculcate new norms of openness across a discipline, and how important that is. In our conversations, and I'll just be blunt, as if I haven't been blunt all along, but when we talk about tenure and promotion, because that's what we're talking about, when we're talking about the incentive to hoard because it's better for my career, we're talking about tenure and promotion. In our conversations with deans and provosts and department heads and others on tenure and promotion committees, basically at MIT, they are all very clear that what matters most in tenure and promotion cases is letters from peers, right? So this is a collective action problem. I can't at MIT change tenure and promotion standards. I need the whole discipline to change so that the letters we get at MIT say, hey, this woman should be promoted because she shared this data set that then had these impacts. But instead we get letters that say this person should be promoted because they had 3 articles in Cell. And we need to change those norms. And that's where I really think societies have to be on board with that, yeah, and can play a really big role.
And it's interesting. So Jenny Larkin in the chat mentioned something. It's a sort of flip side of this. I want to hoard my data, which I actually just dealt with in my job at Science, which is that this reluctance to share because you're afraid someone's going to find a mistake, or more generally, you just don't want people to hassle you. And you think, well, I finished this paper and now I'm moving on with my life, and I don't want somebody to pour through the data and then come back to me and say, well, what about this and what about this? And that interestingly, it strikes me as there's something in my mind very unscientific about that attitude, right? The idea that you don't want people to really advance what you've done. And so we've been trying very hard as a journal to, basically just draw a bright line and say, look, if it's here, if you've decided to publish it, then you really need to follow up, because that's the point of putting it in the journal, right? If you're going to put it in the journal and you're going to stand behind it, then the data are part of the study. But as you said, I think it's a community problem.
That's wonderful. And again, talking about the points of leverage to which you have access, that's your point of leverage, right? You can say, we think this is better science, and if you want to publish with us, these are the rules that we're setting. And scholars will make their choice, right? I strongly suspect that most of them will say, if I want to get published in this prestigious journal, or I want to get hired, I want to get promoted, or I want to get grant funding, or I want to be acknowledged by my society, yeah, I'll make that adjustment because it's better for my career.
Yeah, I think that's the hope.
And Brooks Hansen also just made an important point in the chat, which is it builds trust and integrity in science, right? This is such an important point in the moment in time in which we live, right? In the short term, there may be some more controversy, right? Because science is not A or B, 1 or 2, right? There are ambiguities and there are subtleties and there's nuance. We all understand that. But in the long run, saying, hey, check my work. Hey, build off of this. Hey, let's use machine learning and AI to combine data sets and suggest new research possibilities. This is all good for science and good for society.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to invite if Anne Cumbone-Thompson mentioned the RDA interest group, Shark, sharing rewards and credit. If you want to unmute yourself and elaborate a little bit about that, maybe join the discussion so people can find out some of the details of that.
Yes, so I'm here in France. I'm one of the co-chairs of this RDA interest group. And the aim is to try to find parameters, ways of valuing not only the data by themselves, but all the work that is behind making your data prepared to be shared, because this is a whole work, and there is for the moment in the academic recognition nothing for that. Sometimes you are asked, do you share your data? If you share them, then you have sort of point. But if you explain, I have spent 3 months this year in making this data set prepared to be shared by and to be useful for others, this is valued nowhere. It's not a publication. It's not just a data journal publication. It's all this preparation. So we are working on what could be done in order that the data are cited. So there are standards for citation of resources used. And also try to work with evaluation systems of the academic research in order to find out what could be introduced in those questionnaires, reports that the researchers provide for their career advancement, in order that this is taken into account. It's a long run. It cannot be changed in 3 minutes but having this as an RDA interest group allows to get input from very different parts of the world, and that's precious, and we appreciate it. What we have done for the moment is agreed, which will soon be shared with the RDA community for comments, general comments, agreed for evaluation of the activity of sharing or towards sharing of researchers. So that is the product for the moment, agreed that can be used both by evaluators and a self-evaluation by researchers. And we intend to, of course, continue that work. And we have a session in the next RDA plenary meeting, 17, which is in April, 20 to 23 of April from this group. That's what I can say for the moment. There has been one publication. I can make I can put the link in the chat from that group last year.
That's great.
Let me find so that's what and I'm available for question, of course. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So somebody else mentioned, here it is, David Rosenberg said, the American Society of Civil Engineering has a new reproducible results policy, free open access for papers with verified reproducible results, awards for authors and reproducible reviewers and badges. So I think, that as Greg was saying, I think that's, where you're sort of pushing on the pressure points that you have access to.
And I see there's a lot in the chat about preparing data and curating data and the timing of doing that, and when it's more of a hassle and less of a hassle. There are lots of resources out there. I think maybe we can try and pull together some in some sort of curated list. There are also, I know, experts on this call who are doing work in that space, and if you're so inclined, you can put your projects or your resources in the chat as well. And in no way am I trivializing that issue, because it's a huge one.
Right, absolutely. Okay, my goodness, it looks like we've just about run out of time. But I just want to mention a couple of people mentioned data citation incentives, and I can tell you that in the last year I have quite literally spent about 30% of my time on various task forces and working groups and just other formal and informal discussions with publishers across the disciplinary spectrum, trying to update our policies so that we encourage / mandate citation of data sets and deposited software code in order to facilitate tracking of it. So that is a very big initiative across the whole publisher landscape. Even if it's currently a little bit behind the scenes. So I want to thank everybody again, Greg and Chris, for a really terrific discussion and for just really articulating in a clear and thorough way the parameters that are helpful for moving this area forward and for incentivizing researchers to make their data more open, and the advantage that presents to everybody. I think it's really a win-win. So before we go, I just want to mention that April 2nd, that's the third seminar in the series. It's going to be about public access to research data, guidance, culture, and practice, from Toby Smith at the Association of American Universities and Philip Tarrant from ASU. And that will be, once again, at 10 a.m. Eastern time in the United States, but that's both the US and Europe will be on daylight savings time at that point. And so the UTC, again, will be a little different relative to that starting time. So once again, on behalf of Science AGU and the other 6 sponsoring societies, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks again, Greg and Chris, and enjoy your weekend.